Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheleft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. In the opening weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, Donald Trump consistently came on camera and told Americans that everything was going to be fine. The virus was under control. The number of cases would soon fall from 15 to close to zero. It might disappear on its own. It was comparable to the flu. And even as infections were spreading, hospitals were preparing for disaster and public health officials were warning that the country was running out of time. Trump was talking about packed churches and a reopened economy by Easter. That was the story being told in public. Privately, however, Trump was telling a different story. In early February of 2020, he told journalist Bob Woodward that the virus spread through the air. He described it as deadly and said it was more dangerous even than a serious flu. So he knew this was not an ordinary seasonal illness. And weeks later, Trump admitted to Woodward that he was deliberately playing it down. Not that he had misunderstood it, not that he had received bad information, that he was playing it down. But while the president was publicly describing a threat that would supposedly vanish almost as quickly as it had arrived, people inside his own White House were working on something a good bit more serious. A coordinated national testing strategy. A plan that would use the federal government's purchasing power, logistics network, laboratory capacity, and national reach to organize testing across the country. That plan was developed, and then it disappeared. The administration instead placed the lion's share of the responsibility on individual states, leaving governors to compete for supplies, build their own testing systems, and absorb the blame when those systems failed. And according to investigative reporting, there may have been a political reason for that decision. So the question isn't simply whether the Trump administration mishandled the early pandemic. We already know that it did. The question is whether it walked away from a stronger national response for political reasons. Hello, neighbors. Welcome to another Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. This, of course, is the podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're talking about a national COVID-19 testing plan that was developed inside the Trump White House, then abandoned before it could become implemented or coordinated as a nationwide response that the country desperately needed at the time. And we're talking about the allegation that politics helped to kill it. Now, specifically, the possibility that some people inside the administration saw an advantage in leaving Democratic governors responsible for the early pandemic response, rather than building a national system that might help those governors succeed and receive credit. Now, I want to be precise right from the start here. There is no public document that proves the plan was abandoned to harm Democratic voters. The White House denied that politics drove the decision, and some of the most important reporting does rely on unnamed sources. So this episode is not going to claim more than the evidence supports, but the evidence does support a serious question. While Donald Trump was publicly downplaying the severity of the virus, while privately acknowledging that it was dangerous, his administration was developing a plan and walking away from a stronger national testing strategy because an effective response might have handed a political victory to his opponents. And if that is what happened, what responsibility does a government bear when suffering is not necessarily the goal, but becomes the price it is willing to accept? So, to understand what happened with the testing plan, we have to start with the version of the pandemic that Trump was presenting to the public. On February 26th of 2020, Trump said the United States had 15 confirmed cases and predicted that the number would soon be down to close to zero. That was not a cautious hope offered with the list of uncertainties. It was reassurance, and it was delivered as certainty. The virus was contained, the risk was low, the experts had everything under control. But then the cases kept rising. Trump continued suggesting the virus might just disappear. He compared COVID-19 to seasonal flu, and as public health officials warned that reducing human contact was necessary to slow the spread, Trump began talking about reopening the country by Easter. Easter Sunday in 2020 fell on April 12th. By then, the United States would have reported hundreds of thousands of confirmed infections and tens of thousands of deaths. But Trump's preferred picture was packed churches, reopened businesses, and an economy snapping back to life in time to preserve the image of normality. Because for Trump, the virus was never merely a public health problem. It was a threat to the stock market and a threat to the economy and to the central argument of his reelection campaign, and a threat to his claim that the country was thriving under his leadership. Acknowledging the true danger would have meant acknowledging that extraordinary action was necessary. It would have meant preparing Americans for disruption. It would have meant accepting federal responsibility for managing a crisis that just it couldn't be wished away with the press conference and some good adjectives. So instead, the public was repeatedly told that the danger was limited, temporary, and under control. And that messaging mattered. It shaped how seriously people took the virus. It shaped whether businesses prepared, whether families changed their behavior, whether local officials felt they had political support for difficult decisions. Publicly, Trump was telling Americans not to worry. Privately, he was describing a deadly airborne virus. On February 7th of 2020, Trump spoke by telephone with journalist Bob Woodward. And if you don't remember who Bob Woodward is, he was part of the duo of Woodward and Bernstein, who were responsible for breaking the Watergate scandal back in the 70s. During that conversation, Trump explained that the virus spread through the air. He said it was more deadly than even a strenuous strain of the flu, and that was weeks before he stood before the country and predicted that 15 cases would soon become close to zero. It was also weeks before he began promoting the idea that the country might quickly return to normal. Trump understood, at least in broad terms, that this was a serious respiratory virus capable of spreading through the air and killing at a much higher rate than ordinary influenza. Then, on March 19th, Trump told Woodward what he had chosen to do with that knowledge. He said he wanted to play it down. He said He still liked playing it down because he did not want to create panic. And I understand the argument behind that defense. A president shouldn't create panic. A president should communicate calmly. He should prevent fear from becoming chaos. He should reassure people that the government is functioning and that the competent professionals are working on the problem. But reassurance is not the same thing as misinformation. Preventing panic means telling the people the truth calmly. It doesn't mean telling them a deadly airborne virus is about to disappear. It doesn't mean comparing a new and poorly understood disease to the yearly flu after privately acknowledging that the comparison was false. And it doesn't mean presenting confidence as a substitute for preparation. Americans did not need theater. They didn't need theatrical terror. They needed accurate information. Hospitals needed time to prepare. Businesses needed to understand the risks. Families needed to know how the virus spread. Governors and mayors needed a president who would support urgent action instead of treating every warning as an attack on his performance or his administration. Trump's private comments matter because they eliminate one of the easiest excuses. This was not simply a president who knew nothing and made a bad prediction. He understood that the virus was dangerous. He understood that it spread through the air. And according to his own words, he consciously chose to communicate less urgency than he expressed in private. Meanwhile, inside of his administration, people were confronting a reality that Trump's public statements were trying to soften. They were facing a crisis serious enough to require a national testing strategy. So, as the virus spread, Jared Kushner, president's son-in-law, began assembling his own operation inside the White House. He was, aside from being the son-in-law, he was one of Trump's closest advisors in that first administration, and a man whose job description had already been stretched greatly across diplomacy and criminal justice reform and government modernization and immigration and honestly just about anything else the administration decided needed a family member to be paying attention to it. Now it was going to include pandemic response. The team he helped build drew heavily from the private sector. There were consultants, business executives, volunteers, and people working around or alongside the usual federal agencies. Some had useful contacts, some had logistical experience, some were trying under extraordinary pressure to solve genuine problems. But the operation also had an obvious weakness. It was unclear where its authority began and where it ended and how it fit with FEMA and the Department of Health and Human Services and the CDC and the official coronavirus task force. That meant competing chains of command, overlapping responsibilities, and a national emergency being managed partly through an improvised network built around access to Jared Kushner. Now, it would be easy to turn this into a story about nepotism and amateur hour, and there is plenty to criticize on that front, but that's not the important part. The important part is that Kushner's team understood the country needed something more coordinated than 50 states scrambling on their own. They began working on a national testing strategy, not a vague slogan about doing more tests, but a plan. A framework for using federal power to organize supplies, laboratories, data, and distribution across the country. And this matters because the disturbing part isn't that Kushner's team failed to imagine a national response. It's that they did imagine one. Now, testing sounds simple until an entire country needs millions of tests at the same time. And I imagine most of you who are listening to the sound of my voice remember issues that were going on at the time and needs. You needed swabs, you needed chemical reagents, you needed machines capable of processing samples, you needed laboratories with trained people, you needed protective equipment, you need systems for transporting samples and reporting results and identifying shortages and deciding where limited supply should go first. And every one of those pieces was under strain. The national proposal developed through Kushner's operation reported that it was attempting to bring those pieces together. It envisioned common testing targets, federal coordination of supplies, expanded lab capacity, and better national data. A clearer picture of where the virus was spreading and where resources needed to be. It also could have reduced the absurd competition among states that were bidding against one another for the same masks and swabs and ventilators and testing equipment. I mean, you can remember what this was like. You had all these different governors who were essentially being, thrown into the same emergency auction, and every one of them is trying to protect the hospitals in their state, and they're all bidding against each other. And standing nearby is the federal government, holding the largest wallet, the greatest purchasing power, the broadest view of the crisis, and the best logistics network, certainly better than any individual state. But instead of organizing this auction, it tells the governors to just fight it out. And that's not federalism. What it turned into was a cage match with federal officials refereeing. A coordinated testing system would not have been perfect, but the technology was still developing. Supplies were limited globally. Laboratories were having real capacity issues. No national plan could have prevented every infection or rescued the country from every mistake. But perfection was never really the standard. The question was whether the United States would respond as one country or as 50 competitors trapped inside the same emergency. Testing was the foundation of almost everything else. You can't isolate infections if you can't identify them. You can't trace contacts without knowing who's infected. You can't direct resources intelligently if you can't see where the virus is spreading. And you can't honestly tell the public that the outbreak is under control when the country lacks the testing capacity to know if the outbreak is actually under control. People inside the White House recognize that. This wasn't a failure to see that. They developed a serious proposal for stronger federal coordination. And then the country received something else. The national strategy was never adopted. Instead, the Trump administration moved towards a framework that placed much of the responsibility for testing on governors and individual states. And the federal government would support, but the states would execute. The governors would find the supplies, expand the testing systems, manage the shortages, and then explain the failures. And there's probably some people who find that reasonable, or it may have sounded reasonable at first. States do have a major public health responsibility. Governors understand local conditions better than Washington. Local officials know which hospitals are feeling the most pressure, which communities are the most vulnerable. But there are some things only the federal government can do. A governor can't command a national supply chain. A governor cannot coordinate laboratories across multiple states. A governor can't use the full purchasing power of the United States. A governor can't prevent states from bidding against one another for the same swabs or what have you. And a governor can't create a national picture of a virus moving freely across state lines. Yet the administration repeatedly insisted that states were primarily responsible. Trump said governors needed to step up. Governors needed to obtain their own supplies and manage their own testing. And when those systems faltered, Washington had a ready-made answer. That governor failed. That state mismanaged the crisis. That local official just wasn't prepared. Federal government could claim credit whenever supplies arrived and disown responsibility when they didn't. That is what made the state-by-state approach politically useful. Responsibility moved downward, and the credit remained available at the top. And then blame could be directed wherever the president found it most convenient. So this is where the story moves from documented policy failure into a more serious allegation surrounding motive. In July of 2020, Vanity Fair published an investigation into the national testing plan that was developed through Kushner's operation. The reporting described a proposal that had been built, discussed, and then ultimately abandoned. And according to a public health expert who had worked with the effort, someone inside the group explained why political interest in the plan had faded. At that point, the worst outbreaks were concentrated in states led by Democrats: New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts. Other states that had not voted for Trump as well. According to the source, political advisors believed the administration could leave responsibility with the governors and blame them for the consequences. A successful federal program might have done something politically inconvenient. It might have helped those governors succeed. Now, that is an extraordinary allegation, and it needs to be handled carefully. There is not a public memorandum saying, killed the national plan because Democrats might get the credit. There's no signed order laying out a partisan strategy. The key explanation came through investigative reporting based in part on unnamed sources and people involved with the effort. The Trump White House, of course, denied that politics drove the decision. And later, House Majority staff report cited the Vanity Fair investigation, but it did not produce a separate smoking gun or document proving motive. So no, this is not a case where we can point to a single piece of paper and declare the entire question settled. But that doesn't make this reporting meaningless. Anonymous sourcing is common when journalists are exposing internal government deliberations. People risk careers and access and retaliation when they reveal what was said behind closed doors. The right response is not to treat anonymous sources as automatically true, but it's also not to treat them as automatically worthless. You weigh the reporting against the surrounding conduct, and the surrounding conduct matters here. Trump repeatedly attacks Democrats and was doing so even back then, especially Democratic governors. He demanded praise from governors seeking federal assistance. He framed cooperation as loyalty and criticism as ingratitude. He treated the pandemic response not only as a public health challenge, but as a contest over who would receive credit and who would absorb blame. These are all things that we saw happen in real time in his rhetoric. So the allegation can't be proven with absolute certainty, but it's incredibly consistent with the way the administration governed. And it is serious enough that it should not be waved away simply because no one was foolish enough to type the political calculation onto official White House letterhead. If the Vanity Fair reporting is accurate, the political calculation wasn't necessarily how do we hurt Democratic voters. It was something colder and more familiar. It was, why should we build a federal system that helps Democratic governors control the outbreak and then but making them look competent and giving them credit? And that distinction matters, because the allegation isn't that the administration officials sat around plotting the deaths of people in Democratic states. It's that they may have looked at a national emergency and judged an effective response partly by who was going to benefit from it politically. At the time, Andrew Cuomo was receiving enormous national attention through his daily briefings. Other Democratic governors were being compared with Trump. Some looked calm, some looked prepared, some looked like adults standing next to the president who's kept insisting the virus would disappear. A successful federal-state partnership might have strengthened those governors. It might have shown that coordinated government could work. It might have even forced Trump to share credit. A fragmented response offered him a much better political arrangement. If a state succeeded, he could point to federal help. If a state failed, he could blame the governor. If the governor praised him, that governor was cooperative. If the governor criticized him, that governor was incompetent or ungrateful or partisan or fill in the blank. That is not how a president should approach a national emergency. Governors are not contestants on a reality show competing for the host's approval. Federal supplies are not meant to be gifts from Donald Trump. They belong to the public. And when the federal government evaluates a response based on whether a rival governor might look good in the process, ordinary people become trapped inside someone else's political game. Millions of Republicans lived in those blue states. Millions of independents lived there. Children, nurses, people who had never voted in their lives lived there. The virus didn't care who the governor was. But a political strategy built around denying governors a win would affect every one of the people. The alleged objective may have been political advantage rather than human suffering, but political decisions do not become harmless simply because suffering was a consequence and not a goal. Now, this is where Trump's public messaging and the testing decision begin to fit together. Publicly minimize the danger, privately avoid full federal ownership, tell Americans the virus is under control, tell governors they're responsible for testing, complain that more testing makes the country's numbers look worse. That was one of the events that happened in the whole pandemic chaos of that year that blew my mind the most was when Trump made statements about how the more testing we do, the worse we look, so we should do less testing. And I'm paraphrasing. He didn't say it exactly that way, but you can look up the clips. And then beyond that, preserve the ability to blame someone else when reality breaks through the sales pitch. Trump repeatedly spoke about testing as though the problem was not the infections themselves, but the fact that the testing revealed them. More tests meant more reported cases. More reported cases made the United States look bad. And making the country look bad equated making Donald Trump look bad. But, I mean, anyone with a reasoned mind knows testing does not create infection. It discovers infection. You can't lower the number on the thermometer by refusing to look at it. A fever remains stubbornly unimpressed. A large national testing program would have exposed the true scale of the outbreak. And I think personally that a lot of the conspiracy theories that came out from, you know, the full-blown whack jobs out there who would insist that people weren't really dying and all that was a lie, a lot of that is connected back to this core issue of Trump downplaying testing because testing gave us bad news. But a large national testing program would have exposed the true scale of the outbreak. It would have required the administration to acknowledge that this was not a temporary inconvenience and it was drifting towards zero on its own. It would have produced data that could not easily be massaged into the story that Donald Trump preferred. And it would have made the federal government more visibly responsible for what happened next. And again, that does not prove every testing decision was motivated by politics, but it does show that Trump repeatedly viewed testing through a political and public relations lens and not just a public safety lens. The same president who privately knew the virus was dangerous publicly minimized it. So the same administration that had access to a national testing proposal then shifted responsibility to the states. And the same political operation that worried about case numbers also had reason to worry about Democratic governors looking competent. Those facts don't combine into a written confession, but they form a pattern. And, I'm saying this to you all along. It's one of the main things that I subscribe to as a person is patterns matter and patterns don't lie. A pattern in which controlling the story often mattered more than controlling the virus is what the pattern was here. So the allegations surrounding the testing plan did not emerge from an administration that was otherwise known for keeping politics safely quarantined from science. Dr. Rick Bright was one of the federal government's leading vaccine and biomedical officials. He warned early on about shortages, and he tried to raise concern about preparedness. He objected when political pressure began shaping decisions about unproven treatments. And in a whistleblower complaint, Bright alleged that scientific judgment was repeatedly being pushed aside in favor of political convenience, favored access, and messaging that fit what the White House wanted the public to hear. He also said he faced retaliation after refusing to go along with that game. Now, Rick Bright did not prove why Kushner's testing plan disappeared. He was not offering direct testimony about the blue state calculation business. But his story matters because it shows the environment in which that calculation was allegedly made. This was an administration where experts could be sidelined for delivering inconvenient information, where public health guidance could be softened and unsupported treatments could be elevated because the president liked the sound of them, I suppose. Where loyalty to the message mattered more than accuracy, and where contradicting Trump could become a career hazard. And I mean, we know that's the case. That's only been amplified more so in the second term. Now, this doesn't automatically validate every allegation about the testing plan, but it tells us the allegation didn't appear out of nowhere. It appeared inside a government where science and image and loyalty and political advantage were already colliding on a regular basis. So now we arrive at the question that hangs over all of this. Did the Trump administration want people in Democratic states to suffer? And of course, I can't prove that. The evidence does not establish it. There is no public order directing officials to harm Democratic voters. There is no document stating that deaths were desired as the outcome. And none of us, including me, should manufacture intent simply because the consequences were horrific. But intent is not the only measure of responsibility. Suppose the political goal was not suffering. Suppose the political goal was simply to deny Democratic governors the chance to succeed. Suppose officials understood that a fragmented response would make testing slower and shortages worse and the control of the virus much more difficult. Suppose they knew that those failures would affect real people. And suppose they accepted those risks because a stronger federal response might make political rivals look competent. The question I want to ask is, does the fact that suffering was not the intended goal erase the responsibility for accepting it as a product of the political goal? Public officials make decisions under uncertainty all the time. They can't guarantee outcomes. They can't prevent every death, but they are still responsible for the risks that they knowingly choose. What did they know? What alternatives did they have? What consequences were foreseeable? And who would bear those consequences? What political benefit did they expect to gain? That's the moral ledger that we're working with here. I'm not going to tell you that the Trump administration wanted people in blue states to suffer and die. The evidence does not establish that. What the reporting suggests is that officials may have seen political value in leaving responsibility with the governors rather than creating a national system that might help those governors succeed. They knew what an adequate response could mean. They knew testing was essential. They knew the stakes were going to be measured in human lives. And if the reporting is accurate, they decided that denying political opponents a victory mattered more than maximizing the government's response. So maybe the suffering was never the point. Probably the suffering was never the point. In all likelihood, the suffering was never the point. Maybe it was simply a cost they were willing to accept. And whether that distinction makes it better, well, I'll let you be the judge of that. Now, federalism is not the villain in this story. States should have power. Governors should be able to respond to local conditions. Local officials often understand their communities better than Washington does. But federalism can become a shell game when the federal government pushes responsibility downward while keeping power and resources and credit at the top. That's what makes this story larger than the testing. If Washington refuses to coordinate a national response, states are left competing for supplies. If those states fail, the president can point at the governors. If they succeed, the president can claim that federal assistance made it possible. The responsibility goes down and the credit comes up. And federal resources begin to look less like a public obligation, more like a favor that's handed out by the man in charge. That's especially dangerous when a president sees governors as political rivals. A governor who offers praise is, cooperative. A government who demands more help becomes ungrateful. A state that voted for the president becomes part of the team. A state that voted against him is hostile territory. And I mean, we're seeing this still today. There was just a story in the last week about court documents that show that decisions were made about funding based on whether the state had been won by President Trump in the 2024 election. But Americans don't stop being Americans when their governor belongs to the other party. Federal tax dollars are not presidential property. Emergency supplies aren't gifts. Disaster response is not supposed to double as a loyalty test or a reward for being, cooperative. The weaponization of federalism is not simply refusing to lead. It's refusing to lead, denying others the tools they need, and then blaming them for the predictable result. That's not decentralization. That's more political insulation. So this story is not important because we need one more argument about 2020. It matters because the next crisis will not ask whether we're emotionally ready to revisit the last one. It could be another pandemic. It could be a hurricane or a wildfire or a cyber attack or a terrorist attack or an economic collapse. If and when it comes, the same question will be waiting. Does the president see the country as one nation or as a collection of friendly states and enemy states and useful governors and political rivals? A president is allowed to dislike a governor. Of course, he's allowed to oppose that governor. He's allowed to campaign against that governor. But he does not get to treat the people of that state as collateral in a fight over credit and blame. Once federal protection depends on political loyalty, equal citizenship, it itself becomes conditional. And once that principle is accepted, every future emergency becomes another opportunity to reward allies and punish critics and decide whose suffering counts more than whose. That's why this story belongs in the light. Not because the pandemic is still fresh, but because the danger is. So, to wrap things up here, Trump said he wanted to play down the virus, And that phrase captures more than his public rhetoric. He played down the danger. He played down the urgency. He played down the importance of testing. He played down the federal government's responsibility. And his administration may have played down the human consequences of leaving governors to carry the burden. We know Trump privately understood that the virus was dangerous. We know he publicly minimized it. We know people inside his administration developed a coordinated national testing program, and we know the proposal was never ultimately adopted. We know the administration shifted much of the responsibility to the states, and we know credible reporting alleged that political advisors saw an advantage in letting Democratic governors own the outcome. We don't have a written confession. We can't prove that partisan politics was the only reason the plan disappeared. We can't prove that anyone wanted Democratic voters harmed, but we can judge the decisions that were made. We can judge what officials knew. We can judge the alternatives they had or the risks that they accepted. And we can judge the kind of government that looks at a national emergency and asks not only what will save lives, but also who will get the credit. Maybe suffering was never the goal. Maybe denying Democratic governors a victory was the goal, and suffering was simply something the administration was prepared to risk. Government doesn't have to openly wish harm on its citizens to betray them. Sometimes all it has to do is understand the danger, possess the power to respond, and decide the politics of helping matter more than the consequences of failing. A pandemic does not care how a state voted. Neither should the government responsible for protecting it. All right, folks, thank you once again for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left, this installment of Back Porch Files. I'm incredibly grateful that you did. I would love to hear from you. I mentioned the information at the beginning of the episode, whether you use social media DMs or the email address. Reach out, let me know your thoughts on this or whatever subject is on your mind. It's Friday, so the weekend is here. I'll be back on Monday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of weekend you'd wish for others.